Economic abuse was only recognized as a distinct form in 2000 of family violence in 2008. Legislation and policy has increasingly recognized it, but it is not something that everyone thinks of when they think of family violence. Victims, survivors themselves cannot usually name it. And there is little understanding of this form of coercive control and what it looks like in practice in different cultural and social contexts. This In Focus session is vital listening as part of the Global Summit on Economic Abuse. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Adrienne Adams from Michigan State University. Adrienne and her colleagues have led the way to defining and measuring economic restriction and economic exploitation that constitute economic abuse among intimate partners. The scale of economic abuse has become a reference point for defining and measuring economic abuse across the globe, impacting policy and practice. Welcome, Adrienne. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be having this conversation with you. Adrienne, you are one of the earliest researchers of economic abuse. As a psychologist, what drew your attention to defining and formulating a scale of economic abuse in 2008 as economic control and economic exploitation?
Thank you, Surpiya. It's really a pleasure to speak with you today as well. So that's a great question. You know, from my early work as a domestic violence service provider, I entered graduate school over 20 years ago now, knowing that I wanted to study economic abuse. But to do research on an issue, you have to be able to measure it. And at that time, there wasn't a measure of economic abuse. So that was my first step, creating a measure. So to do that, I talked with survivors, and it was survivors who were receiving services from domestic violence programs, service providers across our state. And through those conversations, I created a long list. I think it was like 120 different things that their partners had done to hurt them economically. And then I took that long list and I surveyed 103 survivors, again, who were receiving services for domestic violence. And I used that data to narrow that 120 item pool down to the 28 item scale of economic abuse. Now, because this was brand new territory, I didn't go into that scale development process expecting to find that economic abuse could be conceptualized as economic control and economic exploitation. That process of narrowing the 120 things that survivors talked about down to the final 28 that made it into the instrument, that was a statistical and a conceptual process. When the data indicated that the instrument had these two factors, I read through the items that were loading on that first factor, and I thought, this sounds like economic control, right? It made sense conceptually to label those things that were loading on that factor as economic control. And then when I read through the items and contemplated, well, what are the items that are loading on the second factor? They were really about exploitation. They were things that involved taking advantage of one's partner economically to their own advantage. And that's how they ended up with that's how economic abuse in that original conceptualization ended up as economic control and economic exploitation.
It was such a defining moment. And so economic control is still seen as, the number one factor, even though you and your colleagues went and revised the scale of economic abuse. Tell me, what triggered that revision?
Yep. So one thing that we wanted to do in that second paper was ground economic abuse squarely in coercive control literature, in coercive control theory. We talked about it as a mechanism of coercive control. So all economic abuse is a function of control, right? It functions to control. And so for that reason, labeling one set of items or one dimension of economic abuse as control, when it's all about control, was problematic, right? It's all about coercive control. So when deciding, when looking across that, what was loading on that addition, that second factor for that subscale, we wanted to search for a term that really more precisely described what the abusive partner was doing. They were restricting their partner's access to and use of economic resources. So that can nicely be distinguished from exploitation, which is using a partner's resources to one's own advantage. So both are the part of the broader system of coercive control. There's controlling elements. One is restricting resources, one is exploiting resources, both to function as sources of mechanisms of control.
I think that term restriction is really apt because, in your work, the limitations of your scale are very precisely defined.
Mm-hmm.
That you really studied victim survivors who were using, family violence services. Yeah, they were
Mm-hmm.
in shelters or in some way connected.
Right.
And you also said that you didn't go into the ethnic minorities. So it was mainly the two groups, African Americans and Anglo Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Yet I think your work has been so defining that people have forgotten those limitations. And
Mm-hmm. I agree.
so, in my work, as a sociologist of money, when we talk about control, we talk about deciding about, how to spend the money. Yeah. And control can be also very good because lack of control makes for a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
where it's difficult to work out how to use that conceptualization of economic abuse in communities of the global south is that the segregation of social roles
Mm-hmm.
is quite profound. And so if you ask a question like, does he control the money? Do you have to ask for money? You kind of then more or less put whole communities of the global south as abusive by culture.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
also at certain times of a woman's life, if a woman is opting out of paid work to look after children, she becomes, for that life stage, dependent.
Right.
Uh, so there is a little bit of a sense of unless something is totally joint or totally independent, it is abusive.
Mm. Mm.
How do we get beyond that in terms of our research and in terms of the way we think of, the different dimensions of control in cultural contexts?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. I agree. This you make incredibly important points. I don't we can't use questions like, do you have to ask your partner for money? Or does your partner control the money as
Hmm.
indicators of economic abuse for all populations? They are indicators of abuse for the populations for which the research has been done
That's
to
right.
establish them as indicators of economic abuse,
That's right.
right? So having to ask for money, we know, is an indicator of economic abuse for women seeking services for domestic violence in the US, for example, right?
That's
Where
right.
where I did my research. So researchers have to develop measures of economic abuse that are valid for use in general populations in different social and cultural contexts. Um, I'm aware of one scale in particular comes to mind. I think they call it the economic coercion scale.
Hmm.
It's used, I think, in Bangladesh. The researcher
Hmm.
is Catherine, I think it's Yount.
Hmm.
Um, and what they did was they generated a pool of items from validated measures of economic abuse that were in existence, and they modified them, added to them, removed some items that didn't work well for that context. And they did that. Part of that, survivors were part of that process. They did cognitive interviews with women from Bangladesh to ensure that they were culturally relevant, and they produced a measure that of economic abuse that works in that context. And that's what we need more of, to be able to
Right.
continue building on this work. It is problematic to take the scale of economic abuse and use it
Yes,
in
and
other populations.
their measures were also for an agricultural population.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Right, right. A
and
specific, it was a rural
uh-huh.
Bangladeshi intention. The purpose of it was for use in a very specific population.
And it isn't as if, the communities of the global south are uniform and homogeneous, yeah? There are
Right.
lots of differences,
Mm-hmm.
and we found that in Australia. I worked with Indian among the Anglo-Celtic Australians and Indian Australians. And yet, that doesn't apply to people from the Horn of Africa in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So even within the global south, there's so many stark differences.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think, uh, what are the next steps for research? I also want to say it's it's because your research was so foundational
Mm.
that some of the cultural constructs
Yeah.
have been seen to be global because there's nothing else of
Right.
the same, that has had the same reach.
And that's where I think research needs to go. We need more research focused on creating measures, conceptualizing economic abuse as it presents in various contexts and cultures. Until we do that, I think what we know about economic abuse is going to remain limited, and the conclusions we're drawing could be potentially erroneous. Right? If you're using a measure that was developed in one context for research in another, you might be drawing conclusions about the prevalence and frequency of the problem, and not actually be tapping into truly what economic you might be capturing and tapping into some other kind of behavior that doesn't
Yeah,
rise to the level of economic abuse. That line between what is what is abuse and what is some other kind of unhealthy, problematic behavior in a relationship. That's that's a difficult right now. I think we don't have a good answer for that. And I spend a lot of time reading in various academic literatures that speak to money and power and intimate relationships, because this is something that I continue to grapple with, that I get questions about, and I know, I'm sure you do too. um, Questions about where is the line? How do you know when something is economic abuse? Do you hear that too?
well, also I think it is, some of us who are now in family violence research, we hear so many stories, and we are studying people who have experienced family violence and
Mhm.
economic abuse. Uh, it's a very different picture that comes when you are studying generally how money is managed and controlled.
Mhm.
And I've come from the opposite side. I spent most of my time studying how money was managed and controlled generally,
Ah.
and then found myself in studying economic abuse. So this you know I've been doing a project on talking of money and not talking of money, and I found myself questioning my own dogmas around
Mm.
financial independence, around financial literacy, financial responsibility.
Mm.
And I found myself saying that male control is not always abusive. And
Mhm.
also, of course, you see, in communities of the global south, money is owned, and the boundary is family, not intimate partner. So
Right.
you studied intimate partners, and that makes sense because money belongs to the couple in
Hmm.
Anglo-Celtic cultures. But money belongs to the family and goes both up and down the generations.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there are lots of silences of economic abuse. For instance, the silence of remittance abuse.
Hmm.
That's
So
not
what's that? Can you
something that
describe
you
that?
have experienced, yeah?
No, no.
In-
Can you describe a little bit more about that?
Well, you see money as a medium however, money is used as a medium of care in cultures, when you don't have the associated morality with it, it becomes a medium of abuse, like the
Mm.
joint account.
Okay.
The joint account is a symbol of partnership and trust. But
Yep.
when the joint account is exploited, it's designer made for abuse.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, similarly, sending money home to your family is a sign of care, of love of your family. But if you're sending money home as just before you want to separate, say in Australia,
Mm.
uh, you're basically sequestering all your money in another jurisdiction,
Mm.
and you're getting half the home because it's community property over
Hmm.
here. However you use money as a medium of care, if you are not using it with the associated morality, it becomes abuse. We don't measure
Yeah.
it then. You see, if,
Right.
like
Right.
in Australia, we don't measure family perpetrated economic abuse, which leaves all the family, all dowry abuse, bride price abuse, remittance abuse. It also leaves all elder abuse out of it.
Mm. So
So,
there needs to be more research too on broadening the types of populations that we look at this phenomenon within, expanding beyond, expanding how we think about it as within intimate relationships to include um, more cultures where there's more of a role of the family in the economic life of the couple, and then
mm,
also for other people who could experience similar kinds of restriction and exploitation.
yes, I think perhaps we have to join hands there and
Yes, yeah.
work together because there are so many things that surprise one as
Hmm.
one hears of how some of our research, which of course has to be limited, but then when those limitations get sort of are ignored and
Yeah,
put into policy and practice, they actually cause more harm than good.
yeah,
And we're beginning
absolutely.
to have that research.
Hmm.
So, but
Yeah,
it's been such a pleasure having this conversation, and I hope our conversations can get together into combined research across
absolutely.
us.
I would
Uh,
love to continue this conversation beyond
yeah,
beyond this space and see how we might put our heads together and do some work
yeah.
together.
Yes, because economic abuse is so universally devastating.
Hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that to that question, I was thinking as you were talking, um, this question of how do we distinguish ab- abuse in whatever context it's happening in from other kinds of behavior. And I as I ponder that question, and I'd love to hear your reaction to this. I think that context really matters. That we have to look at the context within which these behaviors, these tactics are being used, these um, in which these economic decisions and actions are taking place. And I think that there's maybe two elements that are really, really important for being able to identify if something is if a behavior is abusive. I think we have to look at the means by which it happens. It's important to decide or to look at, I'm sorry, how economic decisions and actions in a relationship come about. Are they consensual or are they imposed through force, coercion, fraud, sabotage, manipulation, deception, right? Any other abusive means. And if the person doesn't have a voice or a say, if it's being imposed, if it's not consensual, then that's likely economic abuse, right? So means is one element, and I think outcomes is the other. And it's to what effect, who benefits from a particular economic decision or action, and who's hurt. And that might be economically, psychologically, any other way of being hurt. If one person is benefiting and the other is hurt, and it wasn't agreed that that's kind of how the arrangement was going to go, then that's abuse. I've talked to and I've talked to many survivors who are living a completely different standard of living than their partner, right? Their partner is benefiting while they're being hurt. That's a sign of an imbalance where there is likely economic abuse. So I think means and outcomes may be something for us to really take a close look at, because maybe those are important elements and there may be others that can help us to start to distinguish abuse from other kinds of behavior and to not label as abusive behavior or not label as abusive and the decisions and actions and way of living of entire peoples and cultures in different ways, looking at are these being imposed in ways that hurt somebody, and is one person benefiting to the other's expense or harming another person? What is your reaction to those ideas?
No, I agree absolutely. Where the problem comes is when you start using a tick chart approach. This different means and outcomes you get through hearing the story.
Right. Yes.
And
Yes.
I think you
Measuring it
see,
quantitatively would be quite hard, wouldn't it?
you have to sit and hear the story of a person's life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've heard so many women say, I don't want to have anything to do with the money. And they tell you they're very happy. They have very happy lives
Right.
and happy marriages, happy families. And who am I to say you're
Right.
financially irresponsible?
Exactly. And that's consensual, right? It's an arrangement that's consensual.
Exactly, but I've heard the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is going to be a very major problem in implementing the criminalization of coercive control.
Mm-hmm.
A tick chart approach won't work.
Mm-hmm.
Our services and our first responders have to be able to hear the story.
Right. Right.
So, Adrienne, thank you very much. And
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah. I could do this all day with you. So
Yes, well, one day perhaps we will.
one day, absolutely. It has been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much
Thank
for your
you.
work. And thank you so much for shining the light on economic abuse when most of us did not understand or be able to name it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think whatever be the cultural context, everybody needs to live a life of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Thank you so much.